of the things that made this record really different for us was our last album, The Ride, was done as more or less our 30th anniversary sort of party for ourselves, and we had I think at the end of it 9 different collaborators, and it was a blast, and it made the record was extremely fun, extremely easy to make, because anytime you'd hit the inevitable lull or we'd sort of get log jammed or something like that, we'll be like, hey, let's call Reuben Blades or let's call Richard Thompson, and instantly whatever you were worrying about or dealing with would be blown away by these incredible people coming over to Caesar's house and making this amazing music. But having done that and gotten that more or less completely out of our system, we were really left to our own device on this record, and there are no guests. It's literally just the 5 of us and Cougar Estrada, who's been our drummer for the last 3 or 4 years or so. The song The Valley came relatively early in the process. That was one that, again, came from a Dave demo. But it was, I remember hearing it the first time and thinking, this is beautiful, but it'll never be a track. And it just didn't seem to have I couldn't figure out where the song was. And, but once we sort of figured out structurally what it was, and we added I think the first thing that went on there was the piano came on. The basic track had the backwards guitars and that sort of repeating the ostinato line that sort of, there's like a 3-note repeating pattern that kind of does a cool thing, because it's 3 notes against a 4/4 beat, so it's constantly moving against the track. It's never in the same place, except mathematically wherever the 2 points line up again. So it sort of has this odd dreamlike quality to it. And so we put a piano on there, and then I think Cougar put a cajon, which is literally just a wooden box, but it has this beautiful sort of resonant depth to it, and that once the sort of the rhythmic underpinnings of that came together, you could sort of hear, oh, okay, this is where there's a song in here. And then Louis came up with these amazing lyrics, which I think really kind of set us on the, once those lyrics arrived and got sung, it was sort of, it seemed like it had a grand vision, like the whole idea of immigrants moving and moving west and coming to this valley and then moving on to this other place, that to a certain extent, once that song got written and sung, it was like, wow, this sort of speaks to something a little bit larger than just another record.
It's not like we have a plan and here's the song and here's all the songs and this is what it feels like and this is how we should apply the studio technology to it. That's not the way we work. Sometimes you have to just stand back and let it have its own life and its own dynamic that moves you forward in the work.
That one took a really long time to work on, just because we would put it aside and come back to it and add stuff here and there. Again, it was one that kind of repelled a few larger production ideas because it seemed to want to stay a simple sentiment. I think to a certain extent one of the other subtexts of this whole record is that they're individual stories, that each song is almost one man's tale, more or less. So pumping up a lot of the ideas didn't really seem to fit that sentiment, that it really sort of wanted to be almost like a personal, specific thing, and not a grand Phil Spector-ish production number. Certainly this record and a lot of the records we've made, the technology has gotten to the point where, like for instance, there were a couple of things like these ideas that I tried where everybody gets to take the ideas home and mess around with them on their own time, on their own home computers, and sort of throw things at the tracks and see how they work. And then not necessarily for this record, but for our last record, we were sending tracks all over the world, and it is amazing to me how in just this really short time period, which is a couple of years, we're able to do this stuff so economically, and you're able to just get directly to the work. Like, for instance, we'd work on a track for a little while and then put it aside and then come back to it a month later or 2 months later or 3 months later, and it's exactly as we left it. There wasn't sort of like a lot of times having to build and mix back up. And then like this process, being able to speak to people who want to know about how we put it together, I think it's a wonderful tool, and it's great to be able to get into the minutia of the process this way. So we had finished about 10, 11 of the songs, and we took a break for about a month and just sort of reflected on what we'd done. And kind of became obvious to everybody that we were a few songs shy. At that point, the record had a pretty dark, about 75% of the record was fairly slow. So we sort of all of us had the thought that we needed to brighten things up a little bit.
We came up with a couple things. We found ourselves back in the studio. I found ourselves kind of trying to write this thing overnight. And we came up with the Road Tequila Band, which I thought was really important for the story. And also, it's kind of a really kind of uplifting kind of tune. And Free Up, which the lyric didn't come together until, I think we got done. We left the studio about midnight. I think the lyric got done at 11:05.
It's kind of interesting coming back to it. Again, by the virtue of having our own studio and having all this time, it's something that a lot of the records that I make, for instance. You really very rarely have the luxury of getting to live with what you've done and think about, well, does it need anything else? Is this right? Is this working? So, excuse me, pardon me. So, both those songs were done with a much different spirit. We kind of had we're going to lighten the mood up a little bit. Free Up in particular has the distinction of being written by a good friend of ours, a guy named Eddie Gordetsky, who I think is the first non-Lobo co-write.
He had this idea of what the song should be about, and at that point I was just to romanticize this. Imagine I'm sitting there and there's this waste paper basket that's overflowing with wadded up, crumpled up pieces of paper, that kind of thing. And I was struggling with this, and I said, Eddie, come over here, sit down. What are you saying? And so Eddie and I, we just cranked out this lyric in a matter of 10 minutes, and it was just right. And we went to the studio and gave it to David. David looked it over, and we sat there with the lyric sheet, and he started singing it, and then we kind of made a couple little last minute adjustments to the lyric, and by midnight we had a finished song, and it really did make a big difference.
It's funny because slotting those in, trying to find the proper point in the sequence, it was really interesting because it really changed up to that point we had all been living at that point 6 weeks or so with the sequence of the first few songs that we cut, and had this sort of this density, and then these two new songs, just 2 out of 13 at that point, you wouldn't think would change the gravity of the record, but it completely changed everything. It just sort of had the sequence definitely had this sort of a much more sort of broader spectrum, and I think it really opens the record up. It sort of now has this a really nice sort of arc to it, where it goes from dark to light and fast to slow, that we didn't really have that before we did those last 2 songs.
This thing move faster was when they would call me up and say they moved up the deadline. I swear, because that just got me cooking, and